We're going to take a look at one final sentence from Outliers. It's a little bit longer and more complicated, so I thought I would include it in its own video. Let's get started. Whoa, this one might seem a little intimidating at first, but let's dig right in. But in fact, they are invariably the beneficiaries of hidden advantages and extraordinary opportunities and cultural legacies that allow them to learn and work hard and make sense of the world in ways others cannot. So clearly, there's a lot going on in here. Let's start by using one of our helpful little tips and eliminating all the prepositional phrases, because we know, to really understand what the sentence is doing, we want to find the clauses, whether they're independent or dependent. To do that, we need to know what subjects and verbs there are, and if we can eliminate any nouns that are the objects of prepositions, that makes our life a little bit easier. So let's start there. So we can remove the prepositional phrase in fact, the prepositional phrase of hidden advantages and extraordinary opportunities and cultural legacies. Yes, that's one prepositional phrase. And the final two prepositional phrases, of the world and in ways. So now we can remove all of these words. We know they're not going to be subjects. Taking a look at them really quick, we have a couple things going on. First, you saw that one really long prepositional phrase. It's sharing that single preposition of, and then we have three separate objects. Okay, first object is advantages, which is modified by the adjective hidden. We also have opportunities, which is modified by extraordinary, and we have legacies, modified by cultural. So these are all included in a single prepositional phrase, connected by a couple of ands. You may have noticed that Malcolm Gladwell is using ands here instead of commas. That's just a stylistic thing. You sort of, you have to weigh risk versus reward. Sometimes that works for you, sometimes it doesn't. The more experience you have as a writer, the better your eye and ear for that sort of thing will be. Okay, so once we've removed our prepositional phrases, these are the words that we're left with. They don't really make sense so much as a complete sentence, but now we can at least try to identify some subjects and verbs so we can get to our clauses. But they are invariably the beneficiaries that allow them to learn and work hard and make sense. Others cannot. So kind of a Frankenstein together sentence. But let's take a look and see what things look like they could be verbs of clauses, whether dependent or independent. So we have are, could be a verb here. Allow, learn, work, make, and cannot. So are all of these actually verbs? Are they verbs of clauses? Let's figure that out. Okay. Earlier we eliminated prepositional phrases to get rid of nouns that were not subjects. Here we're going to eliminate infinitives so that we can cut out verbs that are not actually serving as verbs. So we had that one long prepositional phrase that had three objects. Here we have an infinitive that's sharing 1, 2 with three verbs, three base verbs. So learn, work, and make are all sharing that infinitive to. And that's basically what we have here. So learn, work hard. Hard is an adverb modifying work, and make sense. And here sense is kind of acting as, when I've looked into resources for this, I think the correct terminology is it's the object of the action expressed in the infinitive. Whatever. But you can sort of think of it as a direct object of the verb in the infinitive, if that makes more sense to you. So we've eliminated prepositional phrases. We've eliminated infinitives. So all we have left are nouns and verbs that are probably going to serve as subjects and verbs or verb phrases. Okay, so we have but they are inevitably the beneficiaries that allow them, others cannot. So again, the sentence, as we've removed all these things, doesn't really make sense, but we're just trying to identify where the beginnings or base parts of our clauses might be. So we have are, allow, and cannot. Do these, we have to ask ourselves, do these share a subject and subjects? Like we've had prepositional phrases that have three objects but one preposition. So are these three verbs sharing a single subject, or is there a different subject for each of them? So let's take a look at that. Actually, we have three separate sets of subject and verb. So subject they, verb are, subject that, subject that, verb allow, subject others, verb cannot. So three sets of subjects and verbs means that we have three clauses, and now we have to figure out which one or more might be independent and which one or more might be dependent. So here we are. For this to make a little bit more sense, we're going to reinsert the prepositional phrases and infinitives that we cut out before. So our independent clause is, but in fact, they are invariably the beneficiaries of hidden advantages and extraordinary opportunities and cultural legacies. Now we have a dependent clause that allow them to learn and work hard and make sense of the world in ways. And then we have another dependent relative clause, others cannot. So we're going to dig right into these. Again, we've already talked about our prepositional phrases, so we're going to cut those out. Subject they, verb are. We have the the adverb invariably. And one little hint for you, a lot of times adverbs, which are words to describe verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs, will end in ly, and that's what we have here, invariably. So that's an adverb. And since our verb here is are, which is a form of the verb be, we have a linking verb. Okay, so instead of looking for a direct object, we're looking for, if you remember from the previous video, what's called a subject complement. So they are what? They are the beneficiaries. So in the previous video, we had a subject we talked about subject complements that could be adjectives. Here we actually have a subject complement that is a noun, and that's beneficiaries. So now we've talked about everything that's in this independent clause except for the very beginning word, but. Oh, but. Okay, so a little bit about but. But is a conjunction, and there are a couple different types of conjunctions. So a subordinating conjunction undermines the independence of a clause. Okay, that's why it's called a dependent or subordinate clause. These are clauses that begin with words like after, because, when, until, and many, many, many other words. And when you see these words, they're like red flags that should tell you that we have a set of subject and verb, but that clause is not going to express a complete thought. In fact, that clause, its idea is subordinate to the main idea, the main clause, the independent clause. Now we have coordinating conjunctions. You may have heard of these. If you've ever heard of fanboys, to stand for and, nor, but, or, yet, so, that's what we're talking about. These are words that combine or connect to independent clauses. Okay, you can't start. Well, you can start a sentence with a subordinate conjunction, but you have to make sure you have an independent clause later on. So if I said, until I get home from work, we have a subject and verb, I, subject, verb, get, but that clause is not an independent clause because its independence is sort of subordinated by this word until. Coordinating conjunctions, the ones that connect two independent clauses, don't work that same way. They don't undermine the independence of the clause. So you can begin a sentence with but or and or so. Many of you may have been told in your high school English classes that if you do that, you're going to go to English grammar purgatory. But I am really not that strict when it comes to your writing. I think sometimes your writing can be improved. If you want to use an and or a but at the beginning of the sentence, I have no rules against that. You saw earlier Malcolm Gladwell, instead of using commas, used ands. It's just sort of a stylistic choice. So I wouldn't recommend that every single sentence begins with and or but or so, but it's something you can do. So don't, if you had someone in the past who said you should never, ever, 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 ever begin a sentence with a conjunction, that's not really how I roll, and I think, out in the outside world, that's really not going to be much of a problem for you. So that was but, a little history of but. Now I've got a dependent clause that allow them to learn and work hard and make sense of the world in ways. So dependent clauses, we have to identify what their marker word, little red flag word is. And here that's the relative pronoun that. And again, relative pronoun, not too concerned that you remember that term. The subject here is also that. Okay, it might help actually if we identify what the verb is first. Okay, and the verb is allow. So what allows them? Well, it's that allow. So subject, that, also the relative pronoun of the marker word, allow. And now, we had, if you want to try to find what the direct object is, in our previous video we talked about clauses or phrases, like prepositional phrases or an infinitive, can serve as subjects or objects, and that's what we have here. So you can think of the direct object here as being the infinitive phrase to learn and work hard and make sense of the world. Okay, so that allows them what? To learn and work and make hard. To learn and work hard and make sense. Sorry, excuse me. And then we have the indirect object them. Okay, for whom or to whom. And that follows our basic structure, because you'll usually have subject, verb, indirect object, direct object, and that's what we have here. That subject, allow verb, indirect object them, and then direct object to learn and work hard and make sense. And if you remember, that really was probably a confusing video when we talked about let's and how that's a causative verb. That follows the same structure, right? So let us eat cake, or let them eat cake. Let is your verb. Well, actually, if we're following subject, verb, indirect object, direct object, your implied subject is you, subject, let, verb, them, indirect object, and then direct object is like to eat, or to eat cake. That would be the direct object. Let them do what? Let them eat cake. So a little bit complicated there, but that's how this dependent clause is working. Okay. I use this term, if we go back to our previous slide, the relative pronoun. That's what that is. Now, it makes sense to talk about what that is relative to. And when we use that word relative, we're talking about what that word relates back to. If you've ever talked about pronouns, you know, a pronoun is a word that replaces a noun or a pronoun. Or a pronoun is a word that replaces a noun. And that original noun is what's called the antecedent. So we're kind of looking, you know, we're talking about relative pronouns, we're looking in a way for the antecedent, what that word is referring back to, okay? And in this dependent clause, that is referring back to the objects of our prepositional phrase, that big long prepositional phrase. And those objects were advantages, opportunities, legacies. So if we read the sentence, but in fact, they are invariably the beneficiaries of hidden advantages, 1, extraordinary opportunities, 2, and cultural legacies, 3, that allow them to learn, etc., etc., etc. So that is referring back to the prepositional phrase that precedes it, and that is actually, you know, replacing or relating to the 3 nouns in that prepositional phrase. So when we're talking, you know, if you have to think about, because that is the subject, and so you can think of it as being able to insert the 3 objects from the prepositional phrase as the subject of the dependent clause, because that's what that is doing. It's relating that part of the sentence to the dependent clause. Sounds a little complicated, but it's really not terrible. Just think of it as the way a pronoun relates back to a noun earlier in the sentence. That's what a relative pronoun is doing. It's relating to another word or set of words elsewhere in the sentence. Okay, and our final dependent clause, pretty short, but it's a little tricky for one reason, okay? So we have a subject and verb, others and cannot, but we've been talking about, you know, when we have a dependent clause, that we have this marker word. And here we don't know, you know, where's the marker word? We know we have a set of subject and verb, but where is it? And in a previous video we talked about the implied you when we have commands. So, you know, the shortest sentence in the English language is go. And that's a verb. Go is a verb, and the subject there is the implied you. It's a command, so I'm telling you to go. Here, I don't know if this is the technical way you can think about it, but it might make sense if you think about this as being an implied that, okay? Because a dependent clause is going to need to have that marker word or that relative pronoun or whatever you want to call it, however it's functioning. So here's an example. I might say, I dreamt I was breathing underwater, right? Well, we have I dreamt, subject, verb, and then I was breathing, another set of subject and verb phrase. What I'm really mean when I say that is I dreamt that I was breathing underwater, okay? So there's sort of an implied that in this case. And we talked about clauses serving as subjects or serving as objects. In this case, in this example, that I was breathing underwater is actually serving as the direct object of the verb. I dreamt what? That I was breathing underwater. So we're used to looking for just nouns or pronouns as direct objects. But I is not really the direct object here, and water is not the direct object here. It's actually that whole clause, that I was breathing underwater. So when you're looking for a direct object, sometimes you're looking for not just a single word, but an entire group of words that itself might have a subject and verb. So kind of goofy. But long story short, we can think of, if we insert an implied that into the sentence, it makes sense. Make sense of the world in ways that others cannot. Now it becomes a little bit more clear. So dependent marker word becomes this implied relative pronoun that. The subject is others, and the verb is cannot. In the previous use of that, we were wondering what it was relating to. Here it's relating to ways. Cultural legacies that allow them to learn and work hard to make sense of the world in ways that others cannot. So, a lot of times the relative pronoun is going to refer back or relate to a word that precedes it. And here we have ways preceding that space where we would put the that if the that were actually in the sentence. So I hope that makes sense to you. Takeaways. Okay, first, long sentences don't have to be too intimidating, okay? Once we eliminate prepositional phrases, then we're able to find subject and verb pairs, and from there we can identify if we have a single clause, if we have multiple clauses, and then we can figure out what the dependent and independent clauses are. So, I like this trick of just eliminating prepositional phrases because that gets rid of a lot of nouns. And then if you see verbs paired up with to, you can eliminate those because they're not actually going to serve as the main verb of your clause. And now you can figure out what nouns or pronouns pair with what verbs and try to figure out how many sets of subject and verb you have. We've also talked about how a preposition can take multiple objects, but we've covered that in other videos, so it's not really brand new. A single to can be used to form multiple infinitives, or one long infinitive, however you want to look at it. To learn and work hard and make sense, you can think of that as one infinitive sharing the to, or if you want to think of having maybe an implied to in front of each of those verbs, to learn and to work hard and to make sense. We learned that you can think of, when we have a dependent clause or relative clause that doesn't have that marker word, you can think of having an implied that there, or whom. And then one final thing to reiterate, the use of a coordinating conjunction such as but at the beginning of a sentence is not a mortal sin in the English classroom. Okay, so don't be afraid of that. Every semester I have students who say, I had a teacher who said I should never ever do that, and if she saw that she would fail me. So that's not the case here, and I don't think that's really the case in the real world, which is really what I'm most concerned about. So as long as you're able to write usefully in the real world, I think you'll be okay. So hopefully you've taken away a few lessons that will serve you well once you get out of this class.